This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of heartbreak no one sees. It does not leave bruises. It does not always end in slammed doors, screaming matches, or a dramatic goodbye in the rain. Sometimes it looks almost civilized. Sometimes it looks like a woman sitting at the edge of her bed at 11:40 p.m., still dressed, phone in her hand, staring at a message that says just enough to keep her there and not enough to let her breathe. Sometimes it looks like a woman who laughs at dinner, answers emails on time, remembers birthdays, pays her bills, folds the laundry, shows up for work, and still goes quiet the moment the house finally settles down. Because somewhere beneath her capable life, something has been starving for too long. And the most dangerous part is this: from the outside, nothing looks broken. That is why this kind of pain can last for years. Because when love disappears all at once, I know what to call it. I can grieve it. I can rage against it. I can collapse and then begin again. But when respect disappears first, and love keeps wearing its clothes, I start doubting my own instincts. I start wondering whether I am expecting too much. I start rewriting what I know in order to survive what I feel. And that is where so many women lose themselves, not in the fire, but in the fog. There is something deeply disorienting about being loved just enough to stay confused. Not cherished. Not chosen in full daylight. Not held with clarity, consistency, and care. Just kept near enough to remain emotionally available. And if I have lived long enough, loved deeply enough, and carried enough of life on my back, I know this kind of suffering rarely begins with one obvious betrayal. More often, it begins with small permissions. I tell myself he is tired. I tell myself he is complicated. I tell myself he has been through a lot. I tell myself not every man is expressive. I tell myself love looks different when people are older, busier, wounded, divorced, stretched thin, afraid. And little by little, I start making a home inside explanations. That is when the shift happens. That is when I stop asking the most important question. Not, does he love me? But, what does being loved by him actually feel like in my body, in my nervous system, in the privacy of my own life? Because there comes a moment, quiet, private, almost sacred, when a woman realizes the relationship is no longer hurting her because it is difficult. It is hurting her because it is dictionarying something essential in her. She may not say it out loud right away. She may not even have language for it yet. But she feels it. She feels it when she notices that every conversation leaves her more anxious than before. She feels it when she hears herself sounding softer, smaller, more careful than she used to be. She feels it when she begins to celebrate crumbs because the feast never comes. She feels it when she becomes the one doing all the emotional lifting while he enjoys the comfort of her presence without carrying the weight of her heart. And once a woman feels that truth, really feels it, something in her can never go back to sleep. Before I go further, subscribe to the channel if you want more of these quiet, honest conversations. This space is for women who are not looking for performance, noise, or empty advice. It is for women who want language for what they have felt for a very long time but have rarely heard spoken with care. If that is you, subscribe and stay with me. Because this is where the real story begins. I think many women imagine disrespect as something obvious. Cruel words. Public embarrassment. Betrayal that can be proven. But some of the deepest disrespect arrives dressed as convenience. He still calls, but only when it suits him. He still reaches, but never enough to carry anything real. He still wants my warmth, my listening ear, my softness, my body, my loyalty, my understanding, but not the responsibility that should come with access to those things. And because he is not entirely absent, because he is not entirely cold, because he still knows how to sound familiar, it becomes dangerously easy for me to confuse contact with care. But they are not the same. A man can enjoy access to me and still fail to honor me. A man can miss my energy and still not respect my spirit. A man can want my presence in his life without ever intending to protect my peace. That is a brutal truth. And maybe even more brutal is this: sometimes I know it long before I admit it. Sometimes my body knows before my mind catches up. I stop sleeping deeply. I keep checking my phone in moments that should be restful. I replay conversations while driving, while cooking, while standing in the grocery aisle pretending to compare brands of pasta sauce. I begin to live in emotional surveillance. Not because I am dramatic. Not because I am needy. But because ambiguity has a way of making even a strong woman feel unsteady. It keeps her decoding. It keeps her hoping. It keeps her negotiating with reality. And hope, when placed in the wrong hands, can become a very expensive thing. Especially for a woman in the middle of life. Especially for the woman who has already built a career, held a family together, survived a divorce, buried a parent, raised children, restarted, reinvented, stayed useful, stayed composed. Especially for the woman who is tired of chaos and no longer romanticizes struggle, but still finds herself pulled toward a connection that asks much more from her than it gives back. A woman like that may not look fragile. But that does not mean she is untouched. In fact, sometimes the strongest-looking women are the ones bleeding in the neatest ways. What shocks me now is how long a woman can remain in a dynamic that is quietly draining her simply because nothing dramatic happened enough to justify leaving. He did not disappear completely. He did not become a villain in a clean, easy way. He just slowly trained her to live on emotional leftovers. And because she has a generous heart, because she understands pain, because she knows how complicated human beings can be, she keeps staying past the point where staying is noble. That is the moment I want to talk about. The moment a woman realizes love is no longer respect. Not because he said he hated her. Not because he slammed the door. But because she finally understood that confusion was becoming the atmosphere of the relationship. That she was over-functioning just to keep something alive that should not require her constant emotional resuscitation. That she was becoming less radiant, less calm, less herself. That being understood later was no longer enough. That promises with no structure underneath them were beginning to feel like insults. That every time she betrayed her own inner knowing to preserve the connection, something precious inside her dimmed a little more. And here is what makes this realization so painful: when it comes, it does not only expose him. It exposes me too. It shows me where I kept hoping longer than I should have. It shows me where I called survival love. It shows me where I accepted almost because I was tired of carrying everything alone. It shows me where I confused being wanted with being valued. That is not easy to face. But it is holy work. Because the day I see the truth is the day I begin returning to myself. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But honestly. I begin noticing things. How often I feel relieved when he finally texts back, as though my peace should depend on his attention. How often I silence my standards in order to seem understanding. How often I perform strength so no one sees how lonely I have become inside something that was supposed to feel like love. And beneath all of it, I begin to recognize a grief that is older than this relationship, the grief of being the woman who is always expected to be fine. That woman is everywhere. She is the woman who still looks beautiful at the office but cries in the car before driving home. She is the woman who can host dinner for 6 and still eat standing at the counter in silence afterward. She is the woman who can explain everyone else's behavior except the ache in her own chest. She is the woman who tells herself she is lucky to have something at all, even when that something is starving her. And maybe that is why this moment matters so much. Because when I finally realize that love is no longer respect, I am not just waking up to him. I am waking up to what I have been tolerating. I am waking up to the difference between closeness and safety. I am waking up to the cost of overgiving where I am underseen. I am waking up to the terrifying possibility that if I do not tell the truth now, I may lose years not just to the wrong man, but to the slow erosion of my own self-trust. And once that thought enters a woman's heart, the story changes. Because even if she has not left yet, something has already begun. A door inside her has opened. A silence has become sacred. A threshold has appeared. And whether he notices it or not, whether he changes or not, whether the ending comes softly or all at once, she is no longer standing in the same place she was before. She has started to see. And once a woman truly sees, the relationship she had yesterday can no longer exist in the same way tomorrow. Why constant access makes him blind? There is a reason distance changes what closeness could never fix. When a man has constant access to me, he can begin to experience me without truly seeing me. Not because he is evil. Not always because he is intentionally careless. Sometimes it is because human beings have a frightening ability to become blind to what is steady, generous, and near. What is always there can start to feel permanent. What feels permanent is often treated casually. And what is treated casually eventually begins to ache. I think this is one of the most painful truths a woman has to learn in love. Devotion does not always create reverence. Sometimes it creates familiarity without gratitude. Sometimes it creates comfort without consciousness. Sometimes it teaches the other person that I will remain available even when the quality of the connection is quietly declining. That kind of access can distort a relationship in ways that are difficult to explain to anyone who has never lived through it. From the outside, it may look like closeness. We talk often. He knows my routines. He can reach me at the end of the day. He knows how I take my coffee, what kind of music I play when I am driving through Chicago at dusk, what kind of silence means I am hurt and what kind means I am simply tired. He knows the details. He knows the entrances. He knows how to get in. But knowing how to get in is not the same as knowing how to honor what is inside. That is where many women get trapped. We mistake access for intimacy. We think if a man can reach me easily, if he knows me deeply, if he moves in and out of my emotional world without resistance, then surely that must mean I matter in a serious way. But access, by itself, proves almost nothing. A person can become familiar with my tenderness and still fail to respect its cost. A person can grow accustomed to my loyalty and still not understand what it took for me to keep showing up. A person can enjoy the peace I bring into his life while remaining almost completely unconscious of the labor behind that peace. I think of it this way. When I stood near the Golden Gate Bridge years ago, what struck me was not just its beauty, but how strange beauty becomes when I am too close to it. When I am directly under something immense, I cannot fully perceive its shape. I see beams, steel, shadow, fragments. It is only when I step back, only when there is enough distance for perspective, that the structure reveals itself in full. Some people are like that. Some relationships are like that. As long as I remain right there, available, responsive, emotionally present, endlessly reachable, he may never truly take in who I am. He sees pieces. He sees function. He sees convenience. But he does not see the whole architecture of my value. And that blindness can become its own quiet form of disrespect. Not always loud disrespect. Not the kind people immediately recognize. But the subtler kind. The kind that leaves me carrying the emotional center of the relationship while he enjoys its benefits. The kind where I become the place he lands, but not the place he carefully tends. The kind where I am consulted, leaned on, desired, even missed, but still not deeply considered. I have learned that over-access changes the emotional weather between two people. When I am too available, too reachable, too willing to keep the line open no matter how little clarity exists, I remove the natural consequences that might have awakened him. He never has to sit with uncertainty long enough to understand what my presence has been doing for his life. He never has to feel the silence where my emotional labor used to be. He never has to notice that his days run more smoothly because I was always there softening the edges, holding the tone, making things warmer, easier, gentler, more human. And because he never feels the absence, he cannot measure the weight of what he has been receiving. That is why some women spend years being underappreciated by men who are not entirely cruel and not entirely committed. Men like Daniel can become deeply accustomed to the atmosphere a woman creates around them. He may not even have language for it. He just knows that when Naomi is around, there is less friction. There is understanding. There is emotional room. There is patience. There is a certain grace in the ordinary. Her presence becomes part of the architecture of his life. And because it blends into the walls, because it is there day after day, he stops seeing it as a gift and starts experiencing it as background. That is the danger. Not being hated. Being absorbed. Being woven into someone's daily comfort so thoroughly that they stop recognizing that you are choosing to be there. I think women especially understand this pain because so many of us have been taught to make ourselves useful before we make ourselves visible. We learn early how to anticipate needs, lower tension, remember details, make things feel held together. In love, that can become part of our offering. We listen carefully. We notice subtle shifts. We provide emotional continuity. We become a place of return. But when that offering is given too freely, too continuously, without enough mutuality, something begins to happen. My presence starts being consumed rather than cherished. And modern life makes this worse. Constant access does not just mean seeing each other in person. It means texting all day, sending photos, checking in, sharing articles, voice notes in the late evening. Quick updates in the middle of errands. Tiny digital touches that create the illusion of closeness. A man can now have immediate emotional entry into my life without offering any real structure in return. He can know what I am cooking, where I am driving, how my meeting went, whether I made it home safely, what I am worrying about at 10 p.m. and still not be meaningfully showing up for me. That kind of constant contact can produce a false intimacy that feels substantial while remaining deeply unstable. I think that is why some women stay confused for so long. The line is always open. The connection is always humming. There is always some exchange, some contact, some little proof that he is still there. But not all presence is protective. Not all closeness is commitment. Not all contact is care. Sometimes it is just access. And access, when unearned and uninterrupted, can slowly erode value in the eyes of the person receiving it. Not because I lose value. Because he loses sight of it. There is a difference. My worth does not diminish because someone has become casual with it. But the relationship does change when I keep offering sacred parts of myself in a place where they are handled as ordinary. Eventually, I begin to feel the mismatch. I feel it when my efforts are assumed rather than acknowledged. I feel it when my understanding is expected but not reciprocated. I feel it when my softness is treated like a permanent resource instead of a living thing that requires care. This is why I no longer romanticize endless availability. There was a time when I thought love meant removing all distance, all mystery, all restraint. I thought the more accessible I was, the safer the relationship would become. I thought if I stayed open enough, patient enough, understanding enough, the connection would naturally deepen. But life has a way of teaching sharper truths. What deepens a relationship is not unlimited access. It is conscious presence. It is earned closeness. It is mutual regard. It is knowing that entry into my emotional world is not a casual privilege. Distance, then, is not always punishment. Sometimes it is revelation. Sometimes the only way a man can understand the meaning of my presence is to encounter life without its automatic benefits. Without my calming responses. Without my emotional fluency. Without my willingness to keep translating half-love into something survivable. When that access is removed, what was blurred can suddenly come into focus. He may begin to see where he had become careless. He may begin to understand that what felt ordinary was never ordinary at all. It was a woman bringing her full humanity into the room. And yet this truth is not only about him. It is about me too. Because when I allow constant access in a relationship that has not earned it, I also become blind. I become blind to how much I am pouring out. I become blind to how little is actually being built. I become blind to the difference between being included and being valued. Over time, I can start living as though my availability is proof of love, when in fact it may be the very thing shielding me from the truth. That is why access has to mean something. Not in a theatrical way. Not as a game. Not as some cold performance of power. But as an honest recognition that my time, my body, my attention, my listening, my emotional steadiness, my inner world, these are not public utilities. They are not to be handed over endlessly to anyone who knows how to knock. A man should not just be able to enter because he desires entry. He should be able to enter because he has shown that he knows how to respect what he is being welcomed into. And if he does not, then closeness itself becomes the problem. Sometimes the most loving thing I can do is stop letting someone experience me in fragments. Stop letting him have the warmth without the weight, the comfort without the commitment, the access without the accountability. Because the longer I remain endlessly available inside a careless dynamic, the easier it becomes for both of us to mistake that arrangement for love. But love should sharpen vision, not dull it. And when it does dull vision, when it teaches a man to look past what is precious simply because it is near, then distance is no longer the enemy. Distance becomes the only honest mirror left. The story, when I said I was done, everything became clear. By the time I told Naomi I did not think I wanted to get married, I had already been living with that sentence for a long time. I did not say it suddenly. It did not arrive in some dramatic flash of honesty. It had been moving quietly through me for months, maybe longer, like a draft under a closed door. Naomi and I had been together for years in Chicago. We had history, rhythm, habits, private language. She knew how to read my silences better than most people knew how to read words. She could tell when I was withdrawing before I had fully admitted it to myself. And maybe that was part of what made the moment so difficult. When a woman truly sees you, you cannot hide inside vagueness forever. Eventually, you either move toward truth, or you become the reason the room feels heavy. I had already been married once before. I had already failed in ways I could not romanticize. I was not one of those men who could point to bad luck or the wrong woman or the wrong timing and turn that into a clean excuse. I knew I had been the problem in my earlier life. I knew what it meant to be immature with someone's heart. I knew what it meant to enjoy love while still resisting the discipline that love asks of a man. That knowledge should have made me better. In some ways it did. In other ways, it made me more aware of my own instability. I was changing, yes. I was trying to become more honest, more grounded, more worthy of the kind of love Naomi offered. But change is not always noble when it is happening inside a relationship. Sometimes one person's unfinished evolution becomes the other person's private suffering. That was the truth I did not want to face. So one day, in the plainness of an ordinary conversation, I told her. I said I did not think I wanted to get married. I still remember the strange quiet that followed. Not loud silence. Not offended silence. Just a kind of stillness that made the room feel suddenly honest. I think some part of me expected what I had always been given before: questions, resistance, the emotional negotiation that lets a man stay in the center while a woman tries to rescue the future. I expected Naomi to ask what changed, what she had done, whether we could work on it, whether I was sure. I expected tears or persuasion, or at least an argument strong enough to help me feel important in my uncertainty. Instead, she simply said, "Okay." That was all. There was no performance in it. No dramatic pause. No desperate softness. No attempt to make me feel the weight of what I had just done. And somehow, that one word unsettled me more than any confrontation could have. Because in that moment, for the first time, I felt what it was like to say something final and have it received with dignity instead of fear. The conversation ended. She did not call later to reopen it. She did not send paragraphs trying to recover what I had just broken. She did not reach for me in the days that followed. She did not circle back pretending we were just having a hard week. She accepted my words as truth and removed herself from the confusion. At first, I was almost offended by her composure. That is not easy to admit, but it is true. There was a part of me that began to wonder whether she had loved me as deeply as I believed. How could a woman I had been with for years hear something like that and not fight for me? How could she let the silence stand? But that is what ego does. It misreads dignity as indifference. It mistakes restraint for emotional absence. It assumes that if a woman does not collapse in front of you, then she must not have cared very much. I know now how wrong that was. What I could not see then was that Naomi's silence was not empty. It was expensive. It was likely made of tears I did not witness, nights I was not there for, messages written and deleted, drives through familiar streets with no destination beyond getting through the hour. A woman can be devastated and still choose not to beg. She can be heartbroken and still refuse to negotiate with a man who has already told her where he stands. She can love deeply and still understand that there comes a point when remaining available becomes a form of self-abandonment. But at that time, all I knew was that she was gone. And once she was gone, something in me began to change. Life has a way of exposing what comfort hides. In the beginning, I moved through my days with the stubborn pride of a man trying to live inside his own decision. But her absence was not clean. It was not theatrical. It was not even immediately painful in the obvious sense. It was more disorienting than that. Chicago looked the same. The trains still rattled past. The coffee shops still opened at the same hour. The lake still carried that cold, silver stillness in the morning. Nothing dramatic had happened in the outer world. And yet the inner atmosphere of my life had changed. I started to notice where Naomi had been. Not physically. Spiritually. I noticed the emotional steadiness she brought into ordinary moments. I noticed how many of my days had rested on the invisible comfort of knowing she was there. I noticed that her absence did not just remove a person. It removed a kind of warmth from the architecture of my life. The spaces were the same, but they no longer held me the same way. Then I heard she was seeing someone else. And if I am honest, that was the first blow that reached my ego before it reached my heart. People began mentioning him in small, casual ways, the way news travels in circles that pretend not to be carrying it. He was successful, polished, financially secure, physically disciplined. The kind of man the world recognizes quickly. And there I was, standing in the middle of my own unfinished life, forced to look at myself without the comfort of Naomi's loyalty cushioning the view. It did something to me. Not because the other man mattered more than I did, but because her moving on made my decision real. As long as Naomi remained emotionally available somewhere in the background, I could live under the illusion that nothing had truly changed. But once she had stepped into another direction, I came face to face with the fact that I had not just postponed a possibility. I had released a woman who had become central to my life in ways I had only understood after losing direct access to her. I remember going to see my mother around that time. Mothers have a way of speaking into a man's fog without decorating the truth. She asked where Naomi was. I gave her the plain version. I told her I had said I did not want to get married and that Naomi had moved on with her life. My mother looked at me with the kind of disappointment that does not need volume to land. She told me I was making a fool of myself. She said Naomi was my wife. That sentence stayed with me. Later, in prayer and in silence and in that uncomfortable place where a man can no longer hide from himself, I came to the same conclusion. Naomi had been in my heart in a way no one else ever had. Not as a habit. Not as convenience. Not as emotional shelter. As home. And I had only come to understand the scale of that truth because when I pushed her away, she did not stay within reach. So I called her. Even then, I did not call with the arrogance of a man assuming he could snap his fingers and reclaim what he had mishandled. I called with the humility of a man who had finally seen what had been standing in front of him for years. I called knowing I might be too late. I called knowing that clarity often arrives after consequence. But I called because once truth becomes visible, pretending not to see it is its own kind of cowardice. And that is what I carry from that chapter now. I did not come to clarity because Naomi argued me into it. I came to clarity because she honored my words enough to step away from them. She did not rescue me from my confusion. She let me feel it. She let me live inside the emptiness my own indecision created. And in that space, what had been blurred finally sharpened. When I said I was done, I thought I was ending a path. What I did not understand was that her willingness to walk away was the very thing that revealed who she had been to me all along. Walking away is not a strategy to control him. One of the hardest truths for me to accept was that walking away only has dignity when it is real. If I leave in order to force a reaction, I have not actually left. I have only changed positions inside the same emotional game. I am still orbiting his response. I am still measuring myself by whether he notices, panics, calls, apologizes, comes running, finally says the thing I have been starving to hear. On the surface, it may look like distance. But underneath, I am still spiritually standing at his door. That is not freedom. That is suspended attachment. And I think many women know this feeling more intimately than they want to admit. There is the visible leaving, and then there is the hidden hoping. The visible leaving looks clean enough. I stop answering as quickly. I pull back. I go quiet. I reclaim my evenings. Maybe I tell him I am done. Maybe I remove the obvious forms of access. But if my inner world is still organized around making him feel my absence, then I am not really choosing myself. I am still trying to influence him from a distance. I am still asking my worth to pass through his recognition before it can land inside me. That is why so many departures fail to bring peace. They are not departures. They are messages in disguise. I have seen women leave with the secret hope that their silence will finally educate a man who refused to learn through tenderness. I have seen women disappear from the relationship outwardly while inwardly rehearsing the moment he returns transformed. I have seen women say, "I'm done," when what they really mean is, "Please chase me hard enough to prove that I matter." I do not say this with judgment. I say it with compassion. Because when I have been underloved for too long, when I have explained myself until I no longer recognize the sound of my own voice, when I have carried disappointment with grace for more months or years than anyone knows, there is something in me that longs for one final reversal. One final scene where he understands. One final moment where all the confusion breaks open and I am at last seen correctly. But that longing, however human it is, can keep me tied to the very dynamic that is wearing me out. Walking away is not meant to be theater. It is not a performance of power. It is not a cleverly timed withdrawal. It is not emotional strategy dressed up as self-respect. Real walking away is much quieter than that, and far less glamorous. It often happens without a beautiful speech, without a satisfying explanation, without the moment of justice I imagined in my head. Sometimes it happens with tears on my face and no certainty about what comes next. Sometimes it happens in the middle of an ordinary week, after an ordinary disappointment, when my soul simply cannot continue making room for what keeps diminishing it. Sometimes it happens with no audience at all. And maybe that is what makes it so difficult. Because the ego wants witnesses. The ego wants him to know what he lost, when he lost it, why he lost it, and how wrong he was. The ego wants to leave a trail. It wants to be unforgettable. It wants his regret to become proof that my pain meant something. But healing rarely begins there. Healing begins when I stop making my dignity dependent on his awakening. That is the real shift. The purpose of walking away is not to create a lesson for him. It is to stop the injury within me. That means I cannot leave like a woman still bargaining. I cannot leave while secretly offering my absence as one final gift he can use to become the man I needed months ago. I cannot leave while still feeding on crumbs of imagined reconciliation. At some point, I have to become honest enough to admit that staying close to someone's potential has been more destructive than facing their reality. And once I admit that, my departure becomes less dramatic and more sacred. It is no longer about changing him. It is about refusing to keep changing myself into someone who can survive his inconsistency. That kind of leaving carries a very different energy. It does not beg to be noticed. It does not announce itself over and over. It does not throw a final emotional grenade just to hear the echo. It has nothing to prove. In some cases, it says very little. Not because the pain is small, but because over-explaining to someone who has already benefited from misunderstanding me only deepens the exhaustion. There is a point where language becomes another form of labor, another attempt to manage his perception, another effort to make my suffering legible enough to be honored. But not all men are waiting to understand. Some are only waiting to see whether I will remain available despite not being understood. That is why a woman sometimes has to step back without the perfect closing statement. Not because her story is unclear, because it is already clear enough. I think this matters especially in the kind of relationship where ambiguity has become normal. In that environment, I can start believing I owe endless explanation in order to justify my leaving. I feel pressure to build a case, present evidence, walk him through every wound, every disappointment, every quiet fracture. But the truth is, most women who reach the point of leaving have already been speaking for a very long time. They have been signaling, asking, softening, adjusting, enduring, clarifying, waiting. The issue is not that the relationship lacked language. The issue is that language was not being honored. So when I finally walk away, it does not need to sound like a courtroom. It can sound like truth. It can sound like, I cannot continue this. It can sound like, this is no longer healthy for me. It can sound like, I am no longer available for something that asks me to betray my peace. And then it can be silent. Silence is difficult for women who have spent years managing emotional atmosphere. Silence feels risky when I have been conditioned to explain, soothe, smooth things over, make the ending digestible, make my pain non-threatening. But silence can also be the first place my nervous system stops performing. It can be the first place I stop trying to engineer an outcome. It can be the first honest room I have entered in a long time. I think of Naomi here, not as some mythic woman untouched by heartbreak, but as a woman who understood something many people never do. She did not walk away from Daniel to punish him. She walked away because once he made his position known, Remaining emotionally available would have required her to stand inside her own diminishment. Her departure was not a weapon. It was a refusal. A refusal to turn love into self-erasure. A refusal to let his uncertainty become the architecture of her life. A refusal to keep translating his hesitation into hope. That is why her leaving had weight. Not because she made a scene. Because she meant it. And men can feel the difference. They may not always name it correctly. They may call it coldness, distance, pride, stubbornness. But what unsettles them is often not cruelty. It is conviction. It is the sudden realization that the woman they assumed would keep negotiating has stepped outside the negotiation entirely. There is nothing to argue with there. Nothing to manipulate. Nothing to delay. That is why real departure can feel so powerful. Not because it dominates, but because it stops participating in what was draining it. I do not believe every woman needs to leave in the same way. Life is more complicated than slogans. There are marriages, children, finances, histories, illnesses, promises, fears. There are relationships that end in one conversation and others that unravel over months. But the inner principle remains the same. Walking away becomes whole only when it is no longer a tactic. When it is not designed to provoke, bait, test, or orchestrate. When it is simply the moment I decide that love cannot continue to ask me for access while withholding the care that should make that access safe. That decision changes everything, even before the outer details do. Because once I stop trying to control what he does with my leaving, I begin to recover something I may not have realized I lost: authority over my own life. Not loud authority. Not performative strength. Just a steadier, cleaner relationship with reality. I stop arranging my choices around the possibility of his change. I stop writing futures based on his untapped potential. I stop treating my own heart like collateral in a negotiation he never fully entered. And that is when leaving becomes more than an ending. It becomes a return. A return to truth. A return to self-respect. A return to the quiet knowledge that I am not required to remain in any space where my love is welcomed but my dignity is negotiable. When I leave from that place, I am not controlling him. I am finally ceasing to abandon myself. Why he respects boundaries more than begging. There is a painful difference between being open-hearted and becoming available for disrespect. I think many women learn this too late, not because they are foolish, but because they love with sincerity. When I care deeply, my instinct is often to explain more clearly, soften more gently, wait a little longer, and offer one more chance for understanding. I do not begin in desperation. I begin in hope. I begin in goodwill. I begin in the belief that honesty, patience, and emotional generosity can rescue what has become strained. But if I stay in that posture too long with the wrong man, something subtle begins to shift. My openness stops feeling like warmth and starts feeling like permission. My tenderness stops being received as a gift and starts being treated like a guarantee. And from there, the relationship can begin to degrade in a way that is difficult to name but impossible not to feel. That is why boundaries carry a kind of language that begging never can. Begging says, "Please see me." A boundary says, "Whether you see me or not, I see myself." That difference is everything. When I beg, I am placing my dignity in his hands and asking him to return it carefully. I am hoping his conscience will do what his pattern has not. I am hoping the right combination of tears, explanation, patience, loyalty, vulnerability, or endurance will finally create respect inside a man who has grown comfortable receiving without properly valuing. But respect rarely grows out of being begged for. In fact, in many cases, begging quietly erodes it. Not because longing is shameful. Not because pain is unattractive in some cruel, shallow sense. but because repeated pleading in the face of repeated disregard teaches the other person something dangerous, that my standards can be bent by my fear of losing them. And once that lesson is learned, the emotional balance begins to collapse. I do not mean that a woman should never express hurt. I do not mean she should become cold, detached, or incapable of asking for what she needs. That would be another kind of distortion. There is courage in saying, "This hurt me." There is dignity in saying, "I need clarity." There is health in saying, "I cannot thrive in confusion." Those are not acts of weakness. Those are acts of relational honesty. But honesty becomes pleading when I keep offering truth to someone who has already shown me he benefits more from my flexibility than from my wholeness. At that point, I am not communicating. I am bargaining. And bargaining with a man who has grown used to my overextension is one of the fastest ways to lose contact with my own center. Daniel understood Naomi when she stopped trying to be understood. That is what strikes me every time I think about their story in Chicago. It was not that she loved him less. It was that she loved herself enough not to chase clarity from a man who had already spoken his uncertainty aloud. She did not sit across from his indecision and make a campaign out of her worth. She did not flood the room with proof of how faithful she had been, how much history they shared, how much she had invested, how rare their connection was. She did not reduce herself into a persuasive argument. She received what was true, and then she aligned her behavior with that truth. That is a boundary. Not a speech. Not a threat. Not a game. A boundary is the moment my actions stop contradicting what my spirit already knows. And men feel that shift more deeply than they often admit. A man may argue with my words. He may reinterpret them, dismiss them, minimize them, or delay responding to them. But a boundary removes the room where he used to negotiate. A boundary changes access. A boundary changes the atmosphere. A boundary says, "You do not get to continue experiencing me in the same way while refusing to meet the level of care this relationship requires." That does not always make him kind. It does not always make him wise. But it often makes the truth harder for him to ignore. Begging, on the other hand, can create the opposite effect. When I keep reaching after someone has repeatedly shown me their limits, I may believe I am proving devotion. But to the other person, it can begin to read as a lack of self-regard. And that changes how they hold me. Not always consciously. Not always cruelly. But it changes something. They begin to assume I will remain no matter what. They begin to relax in ways they have not earned. They begin to experience my presence as low risk for them and high cost for me. They may still enjoy me, desire me, miss me, even feel affection for me. But enjoyment without accountability is not respect. Desire without restraint is not respect. Missing me only when I pull back is not respect. Respect is what shapes behavior before the loss, not just emotion after the inconvenience. This is where so many women become confused, because they mistake emotional intensity for reverence. A man can feel strongly and still behave carelessly. He can be attached to me and still not honor me. He can want access to my body, my comfort, my listening ear, my emotional steadiness, and still not build his actions around protecting what those things cost me to give. That is why boundaries matter so much. They bring consequence into places where words have been floating without impact. They interrupt the false intimacy created by constant emotional availability. They force a distinction between what a man wants from me and what he is willing to become in order to remain near me in a healthy way. I think part of the reason boundaries feel so hard for women is that many of us have been raised to associate goodness with accommodation. We are praised for being understanding, patient, forgiving, warm, supportive, emotionally intelligent, easy to talk to, easy to be with, slow to anger, quick to see complexity. These are beautiful qualities. But without boundaries, Those same qualities can be consumed by people who admire them without feeling obligated to protect them. Then a woman begins mistaking self-betrayal for maturity. She tells herself she is being compassionate when in truth she is being slowly erased. Begging often begins there. Not in drama, but in over-accommodation. It begins when I keep making allowances for what consistently injures me. It begins when I start speaking to my own pain like it is inconvenient. It begins when I treat my standards as negotiable because I fear that firmness will make me unlovable. It begins when I keep trying to prove that I am reasonable enough, patient enough, safe enough, forgiving enough to deserve a level of care that should not require performance in the first place. But mature love does not ask me to audition for respect. It does not ask me to become smaller so that someone else can remain comfortable in their immaturity. It does not reward my emotional collapse with deeper commitment. And it does not become more honorable because I endured dishonor beautifully. That last part matters. There is a kind of quiet pride some women carry in how much they can survive without becoming bitter. And I understand it. I understand the desire to remain gracious even in pain, to be measured, kind, and composed. But grace can become dangerous when it keeps me in relationships where my generosity is repeatedly mistaken for infinite tolerance. There is nothing noble about helping someone grow more casual with my soul. A boundary corrects that. A boundary is not loud. It is not punishment. It is not emotional revenge. It is not me becoming hard just because life made me tired. It is clarity with structure. It is my inner truth becoming visible in my outward choices. It is the moment when the way I live begins to match the way I say I deserve to be treated. It may sound simple on paper, but spiritually it is one of the most difficult acts a woman can perform, especially if she has spent years being loved inconsistently. Because once I set a real boundary, I must also grieve what that boundary reveals. If he does not rise to meet it, then I can no longer live on the fantasy that he would have, eventually, if only I had explained a little better. That grief is real. But it is cleaner than the grief of begging. The grief of begging is heavy with shame. It leaves me replaying what I said, what I should not have said, how exposed I became, how many times I broke my own line just to feel momentarily connected again. It is grief mixed with self-abandonment. It is grief with residue. A boundary may still break my heart, but it does not ask me to crawl away from my own dignity to get there. This is why men often respect boundaries more than begging, even when they resist them. A boundary signals that I am not merely emotionally affected by his choices, I am willing to reorganize my life around what is true. That carries weight. That speaks of self-possession. That tells him I am not available for indefinite half measures. He may not like it. He may call it harsh. He may accuse me of overreacting, withdrawing, being difficult, being proud. But often what he is really reacting to is the end of casual access. The end of unearned closeness. The end of a dynamic that allowed him to receive the benefits of my devotion without fully honoring the woman who provided it. Naomi did not become worthy when she walked away. She had always been worthy. But her boundary forced that worth out of abstraction and into consequence. Daniel could no longer enjoy her loyalty while postponing the responsibility that should accompany it. He had to confront what her absence meant. He had to see what he had been living inside without naming. Her boundary did not create her value. It revealed whether he could recognize it once it was no longer constantly cushioning his life. And I think that is what boundaries do at their deepest level. They do not manufacture respect. They expose the truth about where respect actually is. If a man can only value me when I am easy, endlessly accessible, endlessly understanding, endlessly willing to remain while my own needs go unmet, then what he values is not me. He values the convenience of my lack of resistance. But if my boundary forces him to confront my full humanity, my limits, my standards, my interior life, my refusal to remain where I am diminished, then at least the relationship is finally standing in honest light. I no longer believe that love asks me to plead for the bare minimum. I no longer believe that endless patience transforms poor character into readiness. And I no longer believe that remaining available under disrespect proves strength. Sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is stop making her pain negotiable. That is what a boundary says. Not that I do not care. Not that I never hurt. Not that I am beyond disappointment. Only this: my heart is not a place where confusion gets to live forever without consequence. Exactly how to walk away, the inner decision. Walking away does not begin with my feet. It begins with the moment I stop asking reality to become gentler than it is. That inner decision is the part almost no one sees. People notice the outward move. They notice when I stop answering, when I stop showing up, when I stop leaving the door cracked open for one more conversation that changes nothing. But long before any of that happens, something quieter takes place inside me. A private reckoning. A slow and almost unbearable surrender to what has been true for longer than I wanted to admit. Because the deepest difficulty is rarely leaving the man. The deepest difficulty is leaving the version of the future I built around him. That is why the inner decision hurts so much. I am not only grieving what happened. I am grieving what I hoped would happen. I am grieving the conversations I thought we would one day have when he was finally ready to speak plainly. I am grieving the tenderness I believed would eventually stabilize. I am grieving the man I kept meeting in flashes, the one who appeared just often enough to keep me emotionally invested but not often enough to build a life with. And this is where many women stay trapped for years, not in the relationship as it is, but in the relationship as it could still become if they just hold on a little longer. The inner decision begins when I can no longer afford that fantasy. It begins when I understand that potential is one of the most seductive forms of emotional delay. It looks noble from the outside. It sounds compassionate. It allows me to tell myself I am not foolish, only patient. Not in denial, only hopeful. But there comes a point when hope stops being a life-giving force and becomes a veil. It keeps me tied to a man who has not actually given me the relationship I am mourning as though I already had it. It keeps me loyal to possibility while my real life grows thin around the edges. That is why the first step is honesty, and honesty is much more severe than people make it sound. Honesty is not simply saying, "This is hard." Honesty is naming what is actually happening without decorating it. It is asking myself whether Daniel has been consistent or simply familiar. Whether what I call connection is truly safety, or only an emotional pattern I have learned to endure. Whether he is confused, or whether his confusion has become a comfortable arrangement that costs him little and costs me peace. Honesty asks me to separate what he occasionally says from what he repeatedly does. It asks me to stop allowing isolated moments of tenderness to erase sustained patterns of uncertainty. It asks me to admit that a man can feel something real for me and still be wrong for my life in the form he currently exists. That is not cynicism. That is emotional adulthood. I think one of the cruelest things a woman can do to herself is continue translating inconsistency into hidden depth. Sometimes a man is not mysterious. He is unavailable. Sometimes he is not wounded in a way that only my love can heal. Sometimes he is simply unwilling, unfinished, or content to let things remain vague because vagueness serves him. I do not say that to flatten the complexity of human pain. I say it because many women lose years trying to rescue meaning from what has already shown itself plainly through pattern. The inner decision begins when I stop bargaining with pattern. I stop saying, "Yes, but when it's good, it feels so deep." I stop saying, "He's under a lot of pressure." I stop saying, He did say he cares. I stop building my emotional life around exceptions. Around rare nights of clarity. Around crumbs of softness that arrive just in time to keep me from fully stepping into the truth. Because if I am honest, what governs a relationship is not the best moment. It is the repeating reality. It is the tone of the ordinary. It is how I live between the hopeful flashes. It is who I become while loving him. That last question matters more than most women realize. Who am I becoming inside this? Not how much do I love him. Not how much history we have. Not whether the chemistry is undeniable. Not whether other people see what I see in him. The real question is whether this relationship is deepening my peace or training my nervous system to survive instability. Whether I feel more like myself, or less. Whether my dignity is intact, or whether I am slowly turning into someone who waits, watches, interprets, excuses, and performs resilience while quietly starving. Sometimes the clearest truth does not come from what he does to me. It comes from what I have had to become in order to remain. That realization is often the beginning of the inner separation. It may happen in a very ordinary moment. Driving home through Chicago after a conversation that somehow left me feeling lonelier than silence would have. Standing in my kitchen, phone face down on the counter, realizing I am already bracing myself before I even read his message. Sitting on the edge of my bed and noticing that my body has become a place of anticipation rather than rest. The mind can argue with reality for a long time. The body rarely lies so elegantly. My body knows when love has become labor. It knows when hope has turned into vigilance. It knows when contact no longer nourishes and only destabilizes. So the inner decision also requires that I listen to myself more than I listen to my longing. Longing is powerful, but it is not always wise. Longing can make me loyal to what once felt beautiful even after it has become harmful in practice. Longing can make me confuse missing him with needing him. It can make me treat chemistry like evidence of destiny. But my deeper self knows the difference between intensity and safety. It knows the difference between being emotionally activated and being genuinely cherished. The inner decision asks me to trust that deeper self again, even if I have ignored her for a very long time. And because truth becomes slippery when pain is involved, I think a woman sometimes has to make reality visible in a very concrete way. She has to write it down. Not the dream. Not the story she tells her friends to make it sound more mutual than it is. The truth. What happened? What he said. How long the pattern has gone on. How many times she has left a conversation feeling diminished, confused, unsteady, or unseen. What contact with him actually does to her peace. The page can be merciless in the best way. It does not blush for me. It does not romanticize on my behalf. It shows me repetition. And repetition is often the evidence my heart kept trying to overrule. There is also a quieter step in this inner process that I think matters more than people say. I have to separate chemistry from compatibility, and attachment from alignment. This is not easy. Chemistry can feel like revelation. It can feel spiritual, fated, rare. Attachment can feel sacred simply because it is deep. But depth is not always goodness. A bond can be powerful and still be misaligned with the life I need. I can crave a man who is not capable of meeting me in a way that protects what is best in me. I can miss him and still need distance. I can feel called toward him and still know that answering that call has repeatedly led me away from myself. The inner decision does not deny these contradictions. It simply refuses to let them rule. And then there is the matter of privacy. I do not think women talk enough about how important it is to decide privately before announcing anything publicly. Because the moment I speak my intention out loud too soon, especially before it has rooted inside me, I may become vulnerable to outside voices, my own second-guessing, or his reaction before I am emotionally prepared to withstand it. Sometimes the strongest thing I can do is let the decision grow in silence first. Let it become sturdy. Let it become mine. Not a threat, not a trial balloon, not a dramatic declaration made in the heat of pain. A real decision. One I have sat with. One I have cried over. One I have tested against loneliness and still found necessary. This is where solitude becomes holy. Not glamorous solitude. Not the kind people post about. The kind that meets me in the car before I go into the house. The kind that walks beside me along the lake when the air is cold and my thoughts are louder than the city. The kind that sits with me in the dim light of my living room while I finally admit that I have been trying to love my way out of information I already have. Solitude is where I hear the truths that constant contact drowns out. Solitude is where I stop reacting and begin perceiving. It is where I stop asking, what if I lose him, and begin asking, what if I lose myself by staying? That question changes everything. Because once I can ask it honestly, the center of gravity shifts. The relationship is no longer only about whether Daniel might change someday. It becomes about whether I am willing to keep paying for his ambiguity with my own inner life. Whether I am willing to spend more months translating mixed signals into hope. Whether I can keep carrying this and still remain whole. And if the answer is no, then the inner decision has already begun, even if no outward step has happened yet. I think that is what women need to understand about walking away. The real departure is not impulsive. It is earned through clarity, earned through grief, earned through the slow collapse of illusion. By the time I am truly ready to leave, I am not leaving because I am angry for one night. I am leaving because I have become intimate with the cost of staying. I have measured it against my sleep, my calm, my self-respect, my ability to be present in my own life. And I have reached the point where I can no longer pretend the cost is acceptable. That is the inner decision. Not a burst of strength. Not a perfect speech. Just a woman sitting with the truth until it becomes more unbearable to betray herself than to disappoint her longing. And once that happens, something inside her goes still. Not numb. Not hardened. Clear. She may still cry. She may still miss him. She may still want to hear his voice on certain nights when the city feels too large and memory gets tender. But beneath all of that, a line has been drawn. Quietly. Irreversibly. She has stopped asking the future to rescue what the present keeps wounding. That is where walking away really starts. Exactly how to walk away, the outer moves. Once the inner decision is made, the outer moves become less dramatic than people imagine and far more difficult than they look. From the outside, leaving can seem almost simple. Send the message. Stop answering. Block the number. Remove the photos. Rearrange the routine. But the body rarely experiences it that neatly. By the time I begin making outward changes, I am not only separating from Daniel. I am separating from habits, reflexes, rituals, and private emotional roads I have traveled so many times that my mind still turns toward them automatically. That is why the outer moves matter so much. They are not just logistics. They are structure for a woman whose heart may already know the truth while her nervous system is still begging for familiar pain. I have learned that if the outer life does not change, the inner decision will be tested in the same weak places over and over again. So the first outer move is not spectacle. It is simplification. When I speak, I have to speak plainly. Not because what happened between us is simple, but because clarity protects me from re-entering the maze. This is not the moment for a 12-page emotional autobiography. It is not the moment to present every wound in perfect order and hope that, if I explain it beautifully enough, he will finally feel the full moral weight of what he has done. Men like Daniel often understand more than they admit. The problem is not always lack of information. Sometimes it is the convenience of delay. And when I over-explain, I can end up giving the relationship one more room to live in. So I keep my words clean. Not cold. Not cruel. Clean. I say what is true without decorating it. I say what I am doing without asking for permission. I do not write from the part of me that still wants to be chosen. I write from the part of me that has already chosen reality. That may sound like, I cannot continue this. It may sound like, this relationship is no longer healthy for me. It may sound like, I need distance, and I am honoring that. The exact sentence matters less than the energy underneath it. I am not opening negotiations. I am naming a line. That line becomes real the moment my behavior starts protecting it. This is where many women suffer more than they expect, because saying goodbye is only one act. Living as though I meant it is 100 smaller acts, often carried out in private, often on nights when no one sees how much discipline grief requires. If Daniel can still reach me whenever loneliness hits him, then I have not changed the architecture of access. If he can still drop into my evening with a casual text and move my whole emotional weather with a single sentence, then my outer life is still too open for the healing I claim to want. So the next move is reducing contact in a way that is honest enough to support my decision. Not symbolic distance. Actual distance. That may mean not answering right away. Then not answering at all. It may mean muting the thread before deleting it. It may mean removing the impulse to reread old messages the way some women revisit bruises just to prove to themselves they were real. It may mean not watching his social media, not checking whether he viewed mine, not asking mutual friends indirect questions dressed up as casual curiosity. It may mean accepting that every small point of contact reactivates more than memory. It reactivates hope, fantasy, attachment, and the body's old training. Distance is not just about him not reaching me. It is about me not reaching for the places where he still lives inside my daily reflexes. That is why the phone becomes such a sacred object in this season. It is no longer just a device. It is a doorway. A relapse can begin in seconds there. One late-night search. One saved photo. One voice note I should not replay. One message I tell myself is harmless because it is short. Women often imagine that healing will be won in grand moments of courage, but more often it is protected in these almost invisible refusals. The moment I do not type his name. The moment I put the phone face down and step away. The moment I let the ache crest without feeding it. There is a kind of discipline in that which no one applauds, but it is holy. I also think a woman has to change her environment more than she expects. Not because she is fragile, but because grief is deeply physical. Chicago can become full of little traps when a relationship has woven itself into the city. A street in West Loop where we once had dinner. A coffee shop where Daniel used to sit across from me acting sincere enough to keep the future blurry. A stretch along the lake where I took his hand and believed calm meant certainty. Places remember. The body remembers even when the mind tries to act composed. So sometimes I have to alter my route home. Choose a different grocery store. Stop visiting the corner of the city where my longing becomes sentimental. Not forever, perhaps. But long enough for those places to become mine again instead of ours. That reclaiming matters. Because walking away is not just subtraction. It is the slow reoccupation of a life I had begun living as though it were always waiting for him to enter it. And in that process, I need one person who can hold the truth without romanticizing my pain. Not a committee. Not a group chat. Not a circle of women who will turn every lonely night into a referendum on whether I should call him. I need one grounded person. One friend, one sister, one therapist, one wise older woman from church, one person who understands that heartbreak makes memory unreliable. Someone who will not let me confuse discomfort with a sign I made the wrong choice. Someone who will remind me that the urge to break no contact often arrives not because the relationship was healthy, but because withdrawal is persuasive. That is another outer move people underestimate, building accountability that protects me from the version of myself that appears at midnight. Because midnight is where many women lose the day's dignity. The apartment is quiet. The dishes are done. The city outside the window seems to belong to other people. The mind begins revising. I remember his softness, not my instability. I remember the way Daniel looked at me once in a restaurant, not the weeks of confusion that followed. I remember promise in isolated moments and call it a pattern. This is when I need a structure more than a mood. A rule stronger than longing. I think every woman leaving something painful needs a waiting practice. Mine might be a 48-hour rule. If I want to respond, I do nothing for 48 hours. I write it in a note and do not send it. I walk. I shower. I sleep. I reread what I wrote to myself when I was clear. I remember that urgency is often the body's panic, not the soul's wisdom. 2 days can save me from re-entering a cycle that 2 months barely helped me exit. The outer moves also have to include the body, because heartbreak is not just emotional. It lodges in the muscles, in the stomach, in the chest, in sleep. If all I do is remove Daniel while leaving a void in my evenings, my nervous system will go looking for him inside the silence. So I have to give sorrow somewhere to move. Not as distraction. As stewardship. I walk along the lake when the air is sharp enough to cut through obsession. I stretch. I swim. I drive with no music and let my thoughts arrive honestly instead of chasing them away. I clean drawers I have ignored for months. I cook meals that take attention. I go to bed earlier, not because I am virtuous, but because exhaustion makes me emotionally porous. These things sound small until I realize how much suffering grows in unstructured time. I begin reclaiming the hours he used to occupy without earning them. Sunday afternoons become mine again. The space after dinner becomes mine again. The moment before sleep becomes mine again. That reclamation can feel strangely empty at first. Women who have lived inside emotional intensity often mistake peace for absence because peace does not spike the body in familiar ways. It does not seduce. It does not keep me checking. It does not make me feel chosen one moment and discarded the next. Peace can feel flat before it feels nourishing. That is why the outer moves require patience. I am not just ending contact with a man. I am retraining myself to survive a quieter life without interpreting the lack of chaos as the lack of love. And then there is the matter of objects. The things women hold on to because they seem innocent. The shirt he left behind. The old card. The photo booth strip in the kitchen drawer. The playlist that turns my car into a shrine. The restaurant receipt tucked into a book. These things matter because they are not neutral. They are tiny altars. They keep a private thread open to the version of the relationship that lives best in memory. I do not need to make a dramatic bonfire out of them. But I do need honesty. If an object keeps me spiritually kneeling in front of what I am trying to leave, it may need to go. Or at least be put away where it cannot keep summoning me into emotional reenactment. None of these outer moves are glamorous. That is the truth. There is nothing cinematic about deleting a number I still know by heart. Nothing triumphant about taking a different street home because the old one hurts too much. Nothing dramatic about putting my phone in another room so I do not answer the message that would reopen everything. And yet this is where the real work lives. Not in the announcement, but in the maintenance. Not in the speech, but in the structure. Because when closeness has become the place where I disappear, distance is not cruelty. It is care in another form. The outer moves are how I make that care visible. They are how I protect the woman in me who has finally told the truth. They are how I stop asking raw willpower to do the work that wise boundaries, changed routines, embodied discipline, and honest support were meant to do. And little by little, these moves begin to create something I could not have forced through emotion alone, a life in which Daniel is no longer the center of every silent room. A life in which my peace does not rise and fall with his impulse to reach. A life in which what I know inwardly is finally given enough outward structure to survive. That is what leaving looks like in the real world. Not one brave moment. 100 quiet decisions that teach my life how to close the door with love, and keep it closed long enough for me to hear my own soul again. Why some men come back the second you pull away. One of the most confusing moments in any woman's life is not always when a man leaves. Sometimes it is when he comes back. Not after true transformation. Not after a season of visible accountability, honest repair, and sustained change. I mean the kind of return that begins the very second I start pulling my energy away. The moment I become quieter, harder to reach, less emotionally available, less willing to keep feeding a connection that has been feeding on me. That is often when his messages become warmer, his tone becomes softer, his memory becomes suddenly poetic, and his sense of urgency begins to sound like love. For many women, that moment feels almost supernatural. I have spent months trying to be heard. Months trying to explain. Months trying to hold the relationship together with tenderness, patience, and emotional clarity. And then when I stop, when I finally begin to loosen my grip, he returns with language, effort, nostalgia, vulnerability, confession, even apparent humility. It can feel like proof that my leaving worked. It can feel like evidence that he did care all along. It can feel like the beginning of the ending I secretly hoped for. But that is exactly why this moment is so dangerous. Because not every return is redemption. Sometimes it is simply reaction. There are men who do not truly awaken when they feel my pain, but do react when they feel my withdrawal. That difference matters more than most women realize. A man may remain relatively unmoved while I am explaining how hurt I am, how confused I feel, how much the inconsistency is costing me. But the minute the emotional supply begins to dry up, the minute he senses that I may actually be reorganizing my life without him, something in him stirs. Not always because he has developed new character. Sometimes because access is disappearing. And access can feel like love to a man who never learned the difference. I think that is why so many women misread the return. We imagine he is finally seeing our value. Sometimes he is. But sometimes what he is seeing most clearly is the loss of influence, comfort, admiration, emotional shelter, physical connection, routine, and control. He is not only responding to my absence as a person. He is responding to the collapse of a familiar emotional arrangement that benefited him. That distinction is painful, but it can save years. Because if I do not understand it, I may confuse renewed attention with real change. I may think the return means the relationship has become deeper, when in truth it may only have become threatened. Threat can produce urgency. Urgency can sound passionate. Passion can look persuasive. But urgency is not the same as maturity. It is not the same as readiness. It is not the same as a man becoming capable of sustaining the kind of love he could not previously maintain. This is where patterns like love bombing and emotional circling become so destructive. A man like Daniel may suddenly become everything I once asked for the moment I am no longer reaching for him. He may speak with more tenderness. He may initiate more often. He may reflect on the past with a kind of selective honesty that is just convincing enough to stir my hope again. He may tell me he has been thinking about me, missing me, seeing things differently, realizing what I meant. And maybe some of that is true. Human beings are often sincere in the moment. But sincerity in the moment is not the same thing as changed structure. That is the question many women forget to ask. What has actually changed beneath the emotion? Not what does he feel tonight? Not how beautiful his voice sounds when memory is doing half the work. Not whether he suddenly seems afraid to lose me. What has changed in his pattern, his self-awareness, his accountability, his capacity to hold consistent care when the threat of losing me is no longer fresh? That is where truth lives. Because some men return not from wisdom, but from disruption. They are disturbed by the fact that the woman who once translated their ambiguity into patience is no longer doing it. They are disturbed that the emotional door they assumed would stay unlocked is now closed. They are disturbed that the comfort of being able to reach me may no longer be available on demand. That disturbance can create a powerful burst of pursuit. But pursuit born out of panic often fades the moment access is restored. I think women know this, even when they do not want to know it. We feel it in the timing. Why now? Why after all the conversations, all the tears, all the moments when I was still there trying to be met honestly? Why is he suddenly ready when my energy is gone? Why does tenderness appear the moment I begin to detach? These questions are not signs of cynicism. They are signs of intelligence. They protect me from calling every emotional return a moral transformation. And then there is nostalgia, which may be one of the most manipulative forces in love even when no one intends it consciously. When a man comes back, he rarely returns carrying the full truth of the relationship. He returns carrying selected memories. The best dinner. The late-night laughter. The weekend when everything felt easy. The way I looked at him one winter evening in Chicago when I still believed steadiness was just around the corner. He remembers my warmth, my softness, my patience, my body, my listening ear, the way I made ordinary life feel more breathable. And because I am lonely too, because grief is not a one-sided experience, I begin remembering selectively as well. This is how toxic nostalgia works. It does not exactly lie. It edits. It lifts the brightest moments out of a complicated reality and places them under a spotlight until the darker patterns begin to look distant, blurry, almost unfair to mention. Suddenly I am not remembering the chronic uncertainty, the emotional fatigue, the mental overwork, the way my body had begun bracing itself before every interaction. I am remembering one song in the car, one snowfall, one soft confession, one look, one apology, one night when Daniel seemed fully present and I allowed myself to believe that moment revealed who he really was. But a relationship is not built on isolated beauty. It is built on repeated truth. That is what I have to hold on to when a man returns the second I pull away. Not the beauty of the moment. The truth of the pattern. I also think some women underestimate how much the nervous system can become addicted to intermittent affection. There is something psychologically binding about inconsistency. When care arrives unpredictably, the body starts chasing the next reward. It scans. It waits. It hangs on. It becomes hyperresponsive to every sign of renewed warmth. So when he returns, especially after silence, I may not only be responding emotionally. I may be responding physiologically. My heart races. My mind lights up. The old hope floods back in with a force that feels almost fated. But biology is not prophecy. Activation is not always intuition. Sometimes it is just the body remembering the cycle. That is why discernment has to become stronger than chemistry in this moment. If Daniel comes back, I have to ask questions deeper than whether I still love him or whether he sounds sincere. Of course I may still love him. Love does not evaporate on command. Of course he may sound sincere. Most people believe themselves in the moment they speak from longing. The real questions are harder. Is he taking responsibility, or only expressing emotion? Is he respecting the distance I asked for, or trying to charm his way around it? Is he showing evidence of changed character, or simply reacting to the fact that I am no longer available in the same way? Is he returning to honor me, or to relieve himself of the discomfort my absence created? Has he changed his pattern, or only his tone? Those questions can feel unromantic, but unromantic questions often save women from romantic disasters. And I think this part is especially important for women in the middle of life, the women who have already spent enough years carrying too much with grace. At this stage, I may not have the appetite I once had for emotional experiments. I may still be deeply capable of love, but I am less interested in being someone's turning point if the turning only happens under threat and disappears under comfort. I have already lived enough to know that longing can make a man eloquent for a week. Fear can make him attentive for a month. Loss can make him poetic for a season. But only character can make him steady. That is why Naomi's power in the story was not merely that she walked away. It was that she did not let Daniel's later clarity erase the truth of what his earlier uncertainty required from her. She did not come back because he sounded emotional. She came back because something deeper had become visible, something grounded enough to carry the weight of a future. That distinction is everything. The point is not that a man can never return honestly. Sometimes he can. The point is that a woman must learn how to tell the difference between a return rooted in transformation and a return triggered by loss of access. Loss of access can make a man reach. Transformation makes him rebuild. Loss of access can make him miss me. Transformation makes him meet me differently. Loss of access can make him speak beautifully. Transformation makes him live truthfully. That is what I have to remember when the message comes at 10:47 p.m. And the city is quiet and my loneliness is looking for a story to believe in. That is what I have to remember when his words touch the exact wound that wanted to be touched. That is what I have to remember when the timing of his return feels almost too meaningful to dismiss. Sometimes timing is not destiny. Sometimes timing is simply the point at which my withdrawal finally interrupted his comfort. And if I mistake that interruption for love, I can walk straight back into the same room that nearly emptied me. So I no longer ask only whether he came back. I ask who he came back as. Not who he sounds like for a night. Not who memory says he could be. Who he is now, in pattern, in responsibility, in restraint, in consistency, in the way he carries truth when there is no guarantee of immediate reward. Because a man coming back can stir the heart. But only a changed man can be trusted with it. The woman who stays too long starts to forget herself. The most frightening part of staying too long is not always what he does to me. It is what happens to my relationship with myself while I am enduring it. That change rarely arrives all at once. It is not usually dramatic enough to alarm the outside world. I still go to work. I still answer people kindly. I still make dinner, return calls, keep appointments, show up for birthdays, pay bills, and remember to bring the right thing to the right place at the right time. From a distance, I look intact. That is what makes this kind of erosion so difficult to name. My life can still appear functional while something essential in me is quietly going dim. I think a woman begins to forget herself in very small ways first. She stops trusting her first reaction. She stops honoring her own discomfort. She starts editing her needs before they are spoken. She becomes more interested in preserving the connection than in preserving her inner clarity. She tells herself she is being mature, patient, emotionally intelligent. But beneath all of that, another process is unfolding. She is adapting to confusion. She is learning how to survive on emotional irregularity. She is building an identity around managing disappointment without ever fully calling it by its name. That is a dangerous skill. Because once I become good at enduring what drains me, I can mistake that endurance for strength. I can begin to admire my own flexibility in situations that are slowly disfiguring my peace. I can tell myself that staying soft inside difficulty is a sign of depth, when in reality I may be teaching my soul to live on too little. Over time, that has consequences. Not just romantic consequences. Personal ones. Spiritual ones. Physical ones. A woman who stays too long often starts to disappear from her own life long before she physically leaves the relationship. She does not vanish in obvious ways. She vanishes in appetite, in ease, in spontaneity, in rest. She vanishes in the small private pleasures that once made her feel returned to herself. Music no longer reaches her the same way. Food becomes something she eats standing over the sink. A free Sunday afternoon becomes another long stretch of waiting without admitting it is waiting. A walk by the lake in Chicago, something that once might have restored her, becomes one more place where she replays old conversations and imagines future ones. She is still present in form, but absent in essence. That is the quiet tragedy. I think women in the middle of life feel this especially deeply because by this stage we know what it costs to hold things together. We are no longer under the illusion that energy is endless. We have lived enough to know that years are not theoretical. They are the substance of a life. So when I spend month after month, maybe year after year, emotionally circling a relationship that never settles into something honorable, I am not just losing time. I am losing access to myself during that time. I am losing mornings that could have been peaceful. I am losing concentration. I am losing the ability to sit still without my mind wandering toward Daniel and the latest unfinished emotional thread. I am losing a certain innocence of spirit that comes from living without chronic emotional vigilance. And vigilance changes a woman. It changes the way I wake up. It changes the way I hear my phone. It changes how often I check, recheck, reread, reinterpret. It changes my posture in my own life. Instead of inhabiting my days, I begin monitoring them. Instead of resting in what is, I become preoccupied with what might happen next. Will he call? Will he soften? Will he disappear again? Will this be the week it finally becomes clear? That kind of inner surveillance is exhausting. It may look invisible to other people, but the body keeps score. Sleep becomes thinner. Shoulders tighten. The stomach holds what the mouth never says. Even beauty stops landing fully because so much of me is occupied elsewhere. And then one day I look up and realize I have become highly efficient but emotionally absent. That sentence lives in more women than anyone talks about. I am functioning, but I am not fully here. I am performing stability while quietly unraveling in places no one can see. I can carry a meeting, host dinner, answer texts, smile at neighbors, remember deadlines, and still feel displaced inside my own life. That is what staying too long can do. It does not always destroy me in visible flames. Sometimes it simply relocates me so far from myself that I no longer know how to get home without first admitting I am lost. There is also a particular humiliation in recognizing how much of my mental life has been occupied by a relationship that never offered me the dignity of real peace. Not because love itself is humiliating. Love is not humiliating. Hope is not humiliating. But there is a sorrow in realizing how much brilliance, tenderness, and emotional attention I have poured into someone who met me only partially while I kept pretending partial was temporary. That recognition can sting. It can make me feel foolish. It can tempt me to either romanticize the whole thing or harden against all feeling. But neither response is honest. The honest response is grief. Grief for the woman I became in order to stay. Grief for the instincts I overruled. Grief for the nights I called anxiety intuition because I wanted the story to mean something more beautiful than it did. Grief for how often I told myself to be understanding when what I really needed was to be protected. Grief for how normal emotional hunger had started to feel. This is why leaving is not only about losing him. It is about recovering me. And recovery begins with noticing what has gone missing. Not just my boundaries, though those matter. Not just my standards, though those matter too. I am also talking about my interior life. My private aliveness. The part of me that used to read slowly, cook with care, laugh without checking my phone, sleep without rehearsing a conversation, walk into a room without carrying the residue of someone else's indecision. That woman does not disappear because she is weak. She disappears because she has been spending too much of herself in a place where emotional return was uncertain. I think this is why certain ordinary things become sacred after heartbreak, especially for women who have stayed too long. A bookstore on a quiet afternoon. A museum where no one is demanding anything from me. Jazz in a small room where the music asks nothing but presence. A long bath after the dishes are done and the phone is finally far enough away to stop running the evening. A walk near the water when the wind is cold and honest. Fresh flowers on the table not because anyone sent them, but because I wanted beauty near me again. These things can look small from the outside, but they are not small. They are evidence that my senses are returning. That life is beginning to reach me again without passing through the filter of Daniel first. Because that is one of the clearest signs that I have stayed too long. Everything starts getting interpreted through the relationship. A song is about him. A Sunday is shaped by whether he called. A good day is fragile because one message can alter it. A bad day becomes an excuse to miss him. Even solitude stops being solitude and becomes a waiting room. That is when I know the relationship has occupied too much real estate in me. Not because I loved too deeply, but because I remained too long in a dynamic that required me to keep translating uncertainty into hope. And yet, I want to be careful here. I do not believe women forget themselves because they are weak-minded or naive. Often it is the opposite. Many women who stay too long are deeply loyal, highly perceptive, emotionally resilient, and capable of carrying complexity with grace. They can see nuance where others see only red flags. They can hold pain without becoming cruel. They can understand history, trauma, fear, and contradiction in another person. Those are not flaws. But without a boundary, those gifts become openings through which self-erasure quietly enters. I begin using my empathy to explain away what my spirit is trying to warn me about. I begin calling self-abandonment compassion. I begin treating my own depletion as the price of being loving. It is not. Love may ask honesty. It may ask patience. It may ask effort, forgiveness, humility, tenderness, and courage. But it should not ask me to become a stranger to myself in order to keep it alive. That is the line. And once I cross it, once I start forgetting who I am, the relationship is no longer simply difficult. It is becoming expensive in a way that reaches far beyond romance. It is affecting my energy, my focus, my body, my work, my sense of time, my ability to feel at home in my own skin. It is shaping the emotional climate of my whole life. That is when a woman has to be brave enough not only to ask whether he loves her, but whether this version of love is making her disappear. That question can break the spell. Because when I really ask it, I begin remembering. I begin noticing what I used to enjoy before my mind became crowded. I begin hearing the tone in my own voice again. I begin feeling the difference between peace and mere quiet. I begin recognizing that what I miss is not only Daniel. Often, what I miss most is the version of myself that was less preoccupied, less depleted, less emotionally divided. And that version of me is not gone forever. She is often waiting beneath the survival strategies, beneath the overthinking, beneath the compulsive hope, beneath the ache of having given too much in the wrong direction for too long. She is waiting in ordinary places. In the kitchen at sunrise. In a slow walk down a neighborhood street. In a church pew after everyone leaves. In the first full breath I take when I realize I do not have to organize my emotional world around his inconsistency anymore. That is why I no longer think the greatest loss in a painful relationship is always the relationship itself. Sometimes the greatest loss is how long I agreed to live outside my own center. How long I called that loyalty. How long I mistook surviving for living. How long I kept pouring attention into a man while my own inner life sat in the dark, waiting for me to come back. And once I see that clearly, the work in front of me changes. It is no longer only about ending something with Daniel. It is about remembering myself with enough honesty that I never again confuse being emotionally occupied with being deeply loved. What real self-respect looks like after the leaving. What surprises many women after leaving is that self-respect does not arrive like a parade. It does not burst through the door with triumphant music. It does not always feel empowering in the way people describe empowerment online. Sometimes it feels quieter than that. Sometimes it feels almost disappointingly plain. I wake up, and he is still not there. The ache has not vanished. The questions have not all dissolved. The apartment is still quiet. Chicago is still moving outside my window with its usual indifference. The trains still pass, the coffee still cools, the evenings still come. And yet something fundamental has changed, even if no one else can see it. I am no longer negotiating against myself. That is where real self-respect begins. Not in revenge. Not in becoming untouchable. Not in proving to Daniel that I can flourish publicly enough to make him regret what he mishandled. Those fantasies are understandable, but they are still tied to him. Real self-respect starts when my life is no longer arranged around his recognition. When my peace is no longer a performance directed at the man who once disturbed it. When I stop asking my healing to be impressive and allow it instead to be honest. Honest healing is much less glamorous than wounded pride would prefer. It often looks like ordinary discipline. It looks like getting through a Saturday morning without checking whether he reached out. It looks like making eggs and toast and eating at the table instead of standing at the counter with my phone in one hand and my thoughts spiraling somewhere else. It looks like washing the sheets, opening the windows, taking the long way home, and realizing I am slowly building a life that no longer depends on emotional chaos to feel vivid. At first, that kind of life can feel strangely flat. Women who have lived too long inside inconsistency sometimes mistake peace for emptiness because peace does not flood the body with dramatic highs and lows. It does not seduce. It does not leave me suspended between hope and disappointment. It simply makes room. And room can feel unfamiliar when I have spent months, maybe years, emotionally crowded. So I think real self-respect after leaving is not only about what I refuse. It is also about what I allow to return. I allow quiet to stop being a threat. I allow a slower morning to matter. I allow my body to learn that not every text tone means something important. I allow an evening to unfold without being interrupted by the old reflex to monitor, anticipate, interpret. I allow ordinary life to become visible again. That sounds small until I understand how much of my inner world had been colonized by uncertainty. There was a time when Daniel's mood could alter the emotional climate of my entire day. One delayed reply could tighten my chest. One warm sentence could make me hopeful in ways that cost me sleep later. One mixed signal could send me into hours of private translation. After leaving, self-respect begins to look like freedom from that level of internal dependency. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But steadily. I notice that my moods are becoming less externally governed. I notice that my thoughts are no longer circling the same emotional drain with the same intensity. I notice that I can make coffee, read a few pages of a book, step outside into the cold Chicago morning air, and actually feel where I am. Presence returns before confidence does. That matters. Because many women think self-respect should feel bold. In reality, it often feels tender first. Tender because I am no longer using denial as anesthesia. Tender because once the chaos leaves, grief becomes easier to hear. Tender because I can no longer hide from how much I accepted, how much I normalized, how much of myself I placed on hold while waiting for something more stable to emerge. Real self-respect does not erase that grief. It makes space for it without letting grief become the architect of my future. That is the difference between grieving with dignity and grieving with self-abandonment. When I was still entangled, my pain often came mixed with humiliation. I felt hurt, but I also felt compromised by how much I was betraying my own knowing to stay connected. There is a special exhaustion in missing someone while simultaneously knowing the relationship is shrinking you. After leaving, the grief becomes cleaner. Not smaller. Cleaner. I may still cry in the shower. I may still miss the sound of his voice on certain nights. I may still be caught off guard by a memory crossing Michigan Avenue or a song in the grocery store that suddenly reaches into an old room in me. But the grief no longer has the same residue of self-betrayal. I am hurting, yes, but I am no longer helping the wound stay open. That is self-respect too. It is not the absence of ache. It is the refusal to keep collaborating with what injures me. And because women are so often taught to measure healing in emotional milestones, I think it is important to say this plainly: real self-respect is deeply behavioral. It shows up in what I no longer permit access to, but it also shows up in the texture of my daily life. It shows up in my sleep improving because I am not bracing for late-night confusion. It shows up in the way I walk into my apartment and feel less dread in the silence. It shows up in how I begin spending money, time, attention, and care on myself in ways that once felt unnecessary or indulgent because so much of me was emotionally occupied elsewhere. I cook differently. I buy flowers sometimes, not for symbolism, but because beauty helps me remember I live here too. I go to a museum on a Sunday afternoon and let myself linger without narrating the day to anyone. I take myself to a jazz set in a small room and realize solitude can be textured, not empty. I read on the couch with a blanket over my knees and no urge to reach for the phone every 6 minutes. I join a walking group by the lake or sign up for a ceramics class not because reinvention needs to be dramatic, but because the hands and body also need places to put all the love that no longer has Daniel as its destination. This is where self-respect becomes embodied. Not theoretical. Not just a principle I say I believe in. It begins living in my calendar, my home, my spending, my sleep, my posture, my pace. It lives in the fact that I stop making myself emotionally available to things that have not earned entry. It lives in the way I protect my mornings now, the way I protect bedtime, the way I do not let loneliness make every boundary sound negotiable by 10:30 p.m. And perhaps most importantly, real self-respect changes the way I experience solitude. Before, solitude often felt like an indictment. It felt like evidence that something was missing, unresolved, unfinished. It felt like the space where Daniel's absence grew louder. After leaving, solitude gradually becomes less accusatory. It becomes informational. It shows me what still hurts, what still tempts me, what parts of me are undernourished, what rhythms of life I abandoned while I was busy loving a man who could not meet me consistently. Solitude becomes the place where I begin hearing my own inner authority again. That authority is quiet. It does not shout. It does not need a speech. It simply begins to say no more clearly than before. No, I do not need one more confusing conversation. No, I do not need to revisit old messages to prove something mattered. No, I do not need to explain my standards until they sound like requests. No, I do not need to make pain look graceful in order for it to count. The return of that inner authority is one of the clearest signs that self-respect is taking root. I begin trusting myself in ways that were difficult when the relationship still had active access to me. I trust what my body feels. I trust what patterns reveal. I trust that missing someone is not an instruction. I trust that chemistry can coexist with incompatibility. I trust that peace may feel unfamiliar simply because I have spent too long adapting to emotional weather I should never have called home. And this changes future love, too. Not because I become harder. Not because I become suspicious of every man who enters the room. That is not self-respect. That is injury dressed as wisdom. Real self-respect actually makes me softer in the right ways and firmer in the necessary ones. It allows me to remain tender without becoming permeable to chaos. It allows me to remain open-hearted without confusing instant access with intimacy. It makes me less dazzled by emotional intensity and more attentive to steadiness. I am no longer as easily seduced by beautiful words spoken in unstable structures. I listen differently now. I watch for congruence. I notice whether a man's presence settles me or scatters me. I notice whether I feel more like myself around him, or whether I begin slowly performing emotional labor just to keep the connection coherent. This is not cynicism. It is refinement. The woman who leaves and truly learns from it does not become unreachable. She becomes harder to confuse. That is a very different thing. I also think real self-respect includes forgiving myself for how long it took. This may be one of the gentlest and hardest parts. Because after leaving, many women become brutal with themselves. They replay every sign they ignored, every concession they made, every boundary they delayed. They look back with the clarity they did not have then and turn that clarity into self-punishment. But that kind of cruelty can keep a woman emotionally tied to the wound just as surely as longing can. Self-respect means I tell the truth about the past without using the truth to humiliate myself. I acknowledge what I tolerated, but I do not reduce my entire character to the season in which I was lonely enough, hopeful enough, wounded enough, or loving enough to stay too long. I become someone who can hold my own history with honesty and mercy at the same time. That, too, is dignity. And eventually, very quietly, something begins to happen. My life stops feeling like a room he left. It begins feeling like a place I live in again. The couch becomes just a couch, not the site of an old conversation. The street becomes just a street, not a memory trap. My phone becomes a tool instead of an altar. My evenings stop belonging to unfinished stories. I begin inhabiting my own days with greater steadiness. The city opens back up to me. Light lands differently. Music reaches me again. Food has taste. Rest feels possible. There are still tender spots, of course. There may always be a few. But tenderness is no longer the same thing as captivity. And maybe that is the most honest description of what self-respect looks like after leaving. Not a woman who never hurts again. Not a woman who became invincible. But a woman who no longer hands her peace to a man and calls that love. A woman who can miss Daniel and still keep the door closed. A woman who can grieve without bargaining. A woman who can sit alone by the window in the evening, tea cooling beside her, city lights flickering across the glass, and feel something she has not felt in a very long time. Not the thrill of being wanted. Not the drama of being pursued. Not the fragile hope of one more text. But the steadier, quieter, more life-giving relief of being back in her own care. If he never changes, your life still does not have to shrink. There is a kind of freedom that only begins when I stop building my future around a man's unfinished becoming. That sentence sounds simple until life asks me to live it. Because for many women, the deepest attachment is not only to who he is. It is to who he might still become. It is to the version of the story that has not happened yet, but continues to shimmer at the edge of hope. If Daniel would only heal. If he would finally see clearly. If he would return with steadiness instead of longing alone. If he would become the man his rarest moments seemed to promise. That kind of hope can keep a woman emotionally paused for years. Not broken exactly. Not destroyed. Just quietly suspended, as though her real life is waiting on someone else's clarity. But there comes a point when I have to ask a harder question than whether he might one day change. I have to ask what happens to my life if he never does. That is the question that brings me back to earth. Because if the entire architecture of my emotional future depends on his transformation, then I have handed him more than my heart. I have handed him my horizon. I have made his growth the condition for my peace. I have made his readiness the gatekeeper of my expansion. And that is too much power to place in the hands of anyone, especially someone who has already shown me how uncertain they can be with something as delicate as my inner life. I think many women shrink long before they realize it. Not always in visible ways. I may still keep my job, keep my home, keep my routines, keep my composure. But internally, my world narrows. I stop imagining a life that does not include his eventual return. I stop investing fully in what is right in front of me because part of me is always turned toward what might reopen. I become reluctant to feel too much joy without him, as though joy would somehow betray the seriousness of what I felt. I postpone my own aliveness in subtle, respectable, invisible ways. I call it loyalty. I call it hope. Sometimes I even call it love. But often it is simply a form of emotional contraction. And love, real love, should not require my life to become smaller in order to prove its depth. That is one of the great maturities of heartbreak, I think, learning that I can care deeply about someone and still refuse to let their limitation become the size of my life. I can grieve what Daniel could not become with me. I can honor what was real, or almost real, or real only in flashes. I can admit that part of me still wishes the story had turned out differently. But none of that means I must remain spiritually bent toward him forever, as though the best room in me should remain preserved for a possibility that may never become a home. This is especially important for women who have already spent decades being responsible. Women who have raised children, carried marriages, rebuilt after divorce, supported aging parents, kept businesses running, moved cities, swallowed loneliness, and still learned how to smile in public. Women like that are often praised for their resilience, but almost never invited to ask whether resilience has become overused. Whether they have become so skilled at carrying emotional weight that they no longer notice when a relationship is requiring too much of their interior life. And then one day they look up and realize they have spent precious years emotionally orbiting a man who was never steady enough to build a world around. That realization can be devastating. But it can also be liberating. Because once I admit that his change may never come, I am no longer forced to keep my own life in a waiting position. I can stop treating my future like a room under renovation. I can stop making emotional provisions for a return that has not earned them. I can stop confusing openness with permanent availability. I can stop imagining that my wholeness will begin after some final conversation, some long-awaited apology, some delayed awakening in him that may or may not ever arrive. Wholeness has to be allowed to begin now, in the life I actually have. That does not mean I become cold. It does not mean I decide love is foolish, or that tenderness was a mistake, or that every unfinished relationship must be turned into a moral lesson. It simply means I stop requiring a certain ending in order to live fully. That is not cynicism. That is release. And release is not the same thing as indifference. I may still care. I may still remember. I may still feel the ache on certain evenings when the Chicago sky turns that soft steel blue and memory becomes louder than reason. But I am no longer arranging my days around the emotional possibility of Daniel becoming someone else. That changes the texture of everything. I start seeing that a life does not have to be paired to be expansive. It does not have to be romantically resolved to be meaningful. There is still art. There is still laughter. There is still the intimacy of friendship, the steadiness of ritual, the pleasure of an ordinary Saturday that belongs completely to me. There is still the museum on a grey afternoon, the long walk by the lake, the little neighborhood restaurant where I bring a book and stay longer than I planned, the fresh groceries on the counter, the jazz pouring low through the apartment while I fold laundry and realize peace has become more interesting to me than emotional suspense. These things are not replacements for love. They are expressions of life. And life should never be placed on hold until one man decides whether he can rise to meet it. I think this is where many women become afraid. Because if I stop centering his change, I may have to face the fact that I do not know exactly what comes next. There is no guarantee of a new love story. No guarantee that the right person will appear on cue to reward my courage. No guarantee that all endings turn redemptive in the ways people like to package them. Sometimes there is only a quieter room, a slower healing, a deeper honesty, and the unfamiliar task of building a life that does not rely on romantic resolution to feel valid. But even that is a form of mercy. Because it returns authority to where it belongs. Not in Daniel's hands. Not in Naomi's story. Not in timing, fate, or fantasy. In mine. I get to decide that my life will not shrink around another person's indecision. I get to decide that if he never changes, I will still travel, still create, still host dinners, still laugh from my belly, still take care of my body, still buy the flowers, still sit near the window with tea and a blanket on cold nights and feel that my life is not a consolation prize. I get to decide that love is not the only sacred thing in the world. Peace is sacred. Self-respect is sacred. Presence is sacred. A life honestly lived, even if imperfect, even if solitary in some seasons, is sacred too. And perhaps this is the deepest turning point of all. I stop seeing my future as something that has been damaged because one man could not fully meet me. I begin seeing it as something still open. Not empty. Open. There is a profound difference. Emptiness is haunted by what is missing. Openness is available to what is still possible. That possibility may include love someday. It may not. But either way, my life no longer needs to be reduced to the dimensions of one unfinished relationship. That is the dignity I want for every woman who has stayed too long in hope. Not the fantasy that he will finally become everything she needed. But the deeper, steadier, harder one, knowing that even if he never does, her life can still widen. Her evenings can still soften. Her body can still rest. Her joy can still return in ordinary forms. Her future can still hold beauty that does not pass through him first. And maybe that is the final truth beneath all of this. A man's inability to grow with me does not mean I am meant to stop growing at all. If Daniel never changes, that is his story. My story is that I am still here. Still breathing. Still becoming. Still allowed to live a life that does not shrink just because love, in one chapter, failed to arrive in its fullest form. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Here is a closing segment you can place at the end of part 11 or at the very end of the full video. Before we close, I want to ask you something simple. When a man only starts showing effort after I pull away, what does that usually reveal? A. He truly values me, but only realized it when I was gone. B. He misses access more than he respects commitment. Comment A or B below. I really want to see where you stand on this. And beyond the poll, tell me your honest view. Have you ever experienced a connection where someone seemed to understand your value only after you stopped being available? Or do you believe real love should never need distance to become clear? Share your thoughts in the comments so other women reading can reflect on them too. If this spoke to something quiet and real in you, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. Your support helps this channel keep creating the kind of honest, thoughtful conversations that so many women need but rarely hear.